Hello everyone, welcome to our Egyptian Online Seminar Group. First, keep your phones off. Then, if you have any questions, you can ask our speaker during his presentation or after his presentation. I have great pleasure of welcoming here Professor Trevor Hopper. Trevor Hopper is one of the top accounting thought leaders in the world. He is currently an honorary professor of accounting at the University of Essex and the Victoria University, and an Emeritus Professor of Management Accounting at the University of Sussex. He was Professor of Management Accounting at the University of Manchester, where he was head of department for 4 years and director of postgraduate studies and research for many more. He has published over 100 articles as book chapters and articles in top-ranking journals such as Accounting, Organization, and Society, the Auditing, Accounting, Accountability, and Accountability Journal, the British Accounting Review, Critical Perspective on Accounting, the European Accounting Review, Financial Accountability and Management, the Journal of Accounting in Emerging Economies, the Journal of Management Studies, and Management Accounting Research. He has been an editor of the British Accounting Review, associate editor of Critical Perspective of Accounting, and a guest editor for special issues of Accounting, Organization, and Society, the Auditing, Accounting, and Accountability Journal, Management Accounting Research, and the Critical Perspective on Accounting. Professor Hopper was awarded Lifetime Achievement Awards by the British Accounting Association and the Global Accounting and Organizational Change Network, the African Accounting and Finance Association Platinum Award for Research in Africa, and an honorary doctoral by Stockholm School of Economics. He was inducted into the Accounting Hall of Fame and received various awards for outstanding papers and several two academic journals. Now we will start our seminar with dear Professor Hopper.
Right, can you put the slides up, please? Right. Hi, folks. Thanks for coming along. And I'm really interested, in provoking a discussion as much as presenting the data that we have here, because the issue that I want to raise very simply is the issue of accounting articles on developing countries, and why are there so few in so-called leading journals, and should there be more, or what are the reasons for so few, or even do what often is regarded as highly ranked journals, is that really true if we look at it in a global perspective? So those are better. So much of what I'm going to do today is just going to be giving some data to inform, hopefully, a discussion and analysis of this situation. Right, can I have the next slide, please? For those of you waiting, we had a technological problem. I couldn't load the slides at my end. Yeah. As we all know, the so-called leading accounting journals are virtually all based in Western countries. And one thing we often, are based in developed or rich countries, rich Western countries. But one thing we often forget is actually these countries are quite unusual. They're not typical of most countries throughout the world. For example, often developing countries, primarily may often be primary producers, have low rates of industrialization, different cultures, histories, and so on. And that's where the bulk of the population of the world live. So why is it that we have, when we look at the articles on accounting in developing countries, they're concentrated on this relatively small number of what might be regarded as unusual countries? A few weeks ago, I gave a seminar, not this one, but a kind of on a similar topic. And somebody said, well, why is it a problem for developing countries? Because really what developing countries do is they just follow what's happened in rich Western countries. They know what to do. That's where the techniques are. And I would say this gives a very outmoded view of development generally. It's really a model of development that goes back to the 1950s, where people believed that there was a linear model of development and specific stages that every country had to go through in order to become more developed. And we now know that's just not the case. Each country has its own path, for better or worse. Another issue, and some of you in this room have contributed to this, often a lot of the research from leading journals may be inappropriate or irrelevant to developing countries. It'll be an issue that comes up constantly. For example, a lot of it is the developing country research is concentrated on capital markets and corporate governance. But a lot of developing countries may have very weak financial markets or no stock market at all. And indeed, very few large corporations, and those that they do have may be family owned rather than widely dispersed shareholders. Another concern is that, well, inadvertently, if the Western leading journals are taken to be the yardstick of what constitutes quality, they may inadvertently support or reproduce a particular hegemony that may or may not be desired or appropriate for a developing country. And again, I've got a lot of the research in the leading journals, not all, but a lot, is neoliberal, positivist, market-based, financial accounting, serving capital markets. For example, there's often a neglect of the public sector, politics, strategic social and environmental goals, culture, and so on. And also, there's been a very heavy emphasis on quantitative analysis of large databases. And there's nothing wrong with quantitative analysis. I'm not trying to make that case. But often in a developing country, you may not have the large databases available, or they may be unreliable. And often to look at pressing issues, you may have to do qualitative work. So the issue really is, are these journals biased against accounting in developing countries? And it's not a trivial matter, because the knowledge that's created and is recognized as important feeds through to policy and practice. International standard setters and international financial institutions such as the World Bank or the International Monetary Fund, often their prescriptions are framed on what is deemed to be leading research. And I and many others have found often when these policies are applied in some developing countries, not all, they prove inappropriate, or they may be adopted but never really seriously used. And lastly, rich countries can learn from developing countries, particularly as in a country such as mine, where poverty and inequality is increasing. There may be some lessons about how best to treat this. Next slide, please. Right. what I'm going to do is I'm going to present the results of two papers. One I think that was available to people here. It was a paper by Yinka Moses and myself. Like a lot of research, it came by chance. We were doing a chapter with colleagues, and we just wanted some on accounting in developing countries. We just wanted a bit of data on what journals had published articles on accounting in developing countries, and we got interested in this, so we did a much deeper analysis. So some fairly quick things. Our definition of developing countries, we use the IMF's World Economic Outlook criteria, which is based on per capita income in a country, but also other factors, export diversification and degree of integration into the financial system. So it's a pretty broad definition. We then tried to identify journals in the A*, A and B category rankings by the Australian Business Deans Council in Accounting Research category 1501 over 20 years, 2009 to 2008. We took the Australian ranking system because we believe that's the fairest and the most rigorous and the most open thing. And then we in those we identified the developing country articles published, and we indexed them by various factors. I won't go through these. Next slide, please. So, some basic questions. Are more developing country articles being published in these journals? And in total, developing country articles constitute just under 10% of all articles in leading journals. Remember, the bulk of the world's population lie in these developing countries. The proportion has more or less remained the same over the 20 years, might have increased very, very slightly. But, most highly ranked journals have had no or few developing country articles, especially the North American journals, which is paradoxical because sometimes, in my experience, academics in developing countries often turn to those journals first. However, even though the number is quite small, the European and Australasian-based journals publish more developing country articles and more that use qualitative methods, and they cover a wider range of topics than the North American, than the articles in the North American journals. Having said that, and if you want to look at individual journals and so on, you've got to look at the article and in much more detail, because there are variations within ranking sets and North American journals and European and Australasian journals. So I'm talking in fairly general terms. And there are newer rising journals that possibly have more developing country research, such as research on accounting in emerging economies, qualitative research in accounting and management, and Meditare. Next slide, please. On which regions and countries is developing country research concentrated or neglected? 78 developing countries have had no accounting articles whatsoever. I mean, that's probably very approximately, probably half of the developing countries have had no articles published, and it's about 40% of the countries in the world approximately. And when we look at where the DC, on which continents and countries the research has been published on, it's concentrated on quite a few countries: China, Malaysia, South Africa, and India. Nearly 61% of all the developing country articles are on those 5 countries. significantly, all are large, relatively rich developing countries. They all have active and sizable capital markets with large financial data sets. We'll come back to that. So the regions and countries where the accounting developing country research is heavily weighted towards Asian countries. And the poorest countries, especially in Africa, Oceania, and North and South America, have been neglected. Next slide, please. Right. What sort of research methods have been used in these papers? And again, is there variation across countries and continents, and by ranking sets of journals, i.e. A-star journals, B journals, and A journals? Quantitative methods predominate. Nearly about 2/3 of the articles have been quantitative and a third qualitative. But what's interesting is 25% of the journals only publish quantitative developing country articles, and just over 12% only qualitative ones. But what's interesting, the higher a journal's ranking, and especially the A-star journals, the more likely it exclusively or predominantly publish quantitative studies. So outside accounting organisations and society, very, very few qualitative studies in A-star journals. And there's a high volume and proportions of quantitative research in China, Malaysia, Egypt, and Indonesia. They were especially concentrated on quantitative research. Elsewhere, in other regions and countries, it's a bit more balanced. I'll give some data below. For example, Oceania had 75% of qualitative articles. Europe, 70%. Africa broke even, more or less, between quantitative and qualitative. Next slide, please. What topics have been studied? The whole of this paper was based around a structured literature review. I won't go into that. And we used two sets of, or two means of identifying what topics the articles were on. We use an Australian software called Leximancer, which again, I haven't got time to go through and explain, but basically makes connections between words to try and link them together. And then we did, to check this, we did a Navivo analysis of word clouds and of all of every article's abstracts and their keywords. Again, the results came out as you might have expected from the previous comments, that the developing country research has been predominantly quantitative, market-based, often positivist studies on international accounting, finance standards, auditing, and corporate financial reporting, economic performance and governance, especially in China. And actually, even the qualitative papers, albeit to a lesser degree, concentrated on similar topics. However, when we turn to the sociological qualitative papers, they pursue much broader topics, such as social environmental accounting, systems implementation of management accounting systems, development of the accounting profession and professionalization, and so on. But for some very important issues has been, we would argue, being neglected, such as accounting and accountability of non-governmental organizations and microfinance organizations, problems of publishing research and doing research in developing countries, and particularly the role of external parties on accounting in developing countries, such as foreign accounting associations, particularly the ACCA, and international standard setters, and also the World Bank and IMF will be particularly influential. So again, we get this very concentrated volume of work on essentially quantitative, positivist, market-based financial and auditing research in a relatively small number of countries. Next slide, please. Do topics vary across countries, continents, and journal rankings sets? Well, this is to some extent repeating here. There's a dominance of quantitative market-based research on financial reporting, auditing, and corporate governance, especially in the Asian articles. Little work on other topics, especially the papers on China and Malaysia. Whereas, as we said previously, papers on Africa and Oceania have examined broad topics, use a wider range of social theories, and are more inclined to use qualitative methods. And again, to repeat myself, the journals publishing qualitative articles cover more topics across more countries, and I've given examples there. But having said that, there are some variation of topics being pursued within a continent by different countries. So, for example, there are some Asian countries that have quite a high proportion of qualitative articles, not many, but some. Next slide, please. Which countries and continents were corresponding authors institutions? Most of the correspondence, most corresponding authors came from Asia, 37%, Oceania, 23%, and Europe, nearly 18%. Interesting, I was surprised about this. Most corresponding authors came from Australia, followed by the United Kingdom, China, Malaysia, New Zealand, South Africa, Hong Kong, and Canada and India. So the corresponding authors providing most EC articles were also working in institutions in Australasia, South Africa, Malaysia, and Hong Kong. That's where they were working. The one thing that we don't know is whether or not they were born in a developing country and had moved to these countries, to universities there. These corresponding authors provided 83 articles, 4 in A-star, 31 in A-ranked journals, and 48 in B-ranked journals. And 67%, 56 of these articles were on quantitative methods. What's interesting here is that the bulk of corresponding authors have come from British Commonwealth countries and universities. We're not exactly sure why that is. Possibly it's a lingering effect of colonialism, or whether it's due to Commonwealth links and so on, and possibly where PhD students undertake their PhDs. We just don't know the answer to that. Next slide, please. Right, yeah. Which qualitative and quantitative articles from which journals have had the greatest impact? Collins, I see that you've raised the question of language, and I think I quite deliberately said we talked about English language journals, and this is something I'm sure we'll want to discuss later. Our research didn't incorporate articles, let's say in French or Spanish, and it's a weakness of the research. Yeah, so we collected the citations on Google Scholar of every developing country article and assumed that this is a marker of their impact. Now, the 3 most cited articles were in 2 A-star ranked journals, Contemporary Accounting Research and the Accounting Review. All were market-based studies of audit quality in China. When we looked at the 10 most cited papers that employed quantitative methods, again, they were predominantly on financial disclosure and audit quality in 3 countries spanning 2 continents, China, Malaysia, and Egypt. And so again, if we look at the articles with the highest citations, the high citations came in North American journals oriented to market-based studies, which ironically rarely publish articles on developing countries, and they were on a very narrow range of topics and countries. Again, when we looked at the 10 most cited qualitative articles, they explored more diverse topics, such as social environmental accounting, intellectual capital, roles of auditor, management control, even apartheid, and black accountants, and they were in 9 developing countries spanning 3 continents. So again, we get this finding that the qualitative articles covered a wider spectrum of countries, topics, and theories. Next slide, please. Yeah, I'll just briefly look at a second paper which is under review at a journal with the other 2 authors from York University in Canada. And I thought I'd just do this because particularly as this seminar is based in Africa, it'd be interesting to look at some similar research we've done on the African articles in ranked English language journals over a similar time period, 2000 to 2019. And this analyzes publication trends, countries studied, topics, research methods, authors, and citations in African articles ranked A or above in the Australian Business Dean Council category. So that's similar to our study, except or the last study we looked at, but this paper doesn't include African articles in ABDC B-ranked journals, but it also includes journals ranked 2+ in the Association of Business School lists. So it gives a slightly different set of articles. This identified 38 journals that 6 Tier 1 journals, A-star in the ABDC list and 4+ in ABS lists, 18 Tier 2 journals, and 14 Tier 3 journals. Right, next slide, please. Yeah, these 38 journals published 179 African articles, which is less than 1% of all their articles. I looked this up actually. Africa has about 17% of the world's population. So 1% of the African articles, the so-called leading journals, only 1% of their articles are on African countries. African accounting research is absent in almost all top 6 accounting journals and little presence in the others. It was 0.2% of papers in the top 6 journals, just 9 papers out of over 5,000, 1% in Tier 2 journals, 98 out of nearly 10,000, and just over 1% in Tier 3 journals. 13 of the 38 journals have had no African publications, and another 13 less than 5. And of those 13, 10 only had 1. If we look at the Tier 1 journals, the Journal of Accounting Research, Journal of Accounting and Economics, the Accounting Review had no African articles, and Contemporary Accounting Research and Review of Accounting Studies had 1 each. This is over 20 years. Again, Accounting Organised Society had somewhat more African articles in each 5-year period, but even then it was only 7, which was less than 1% of its papers. And the journals with the highest proportion of African articles were Management Accounting Journal, Accounting, Auditing and Accountability, and the Journal of International Accounting and Qualitative Research on Accounting and Management. So basically, they don't publish much on Africa. Right, next slide, please. Which countries have had articles of Africa? Well, basically, the greater a country's population, the greater its wealth, and having a possession of active capital markets, then the more likely it will have research in highly ranked accounting journals. And 19 of the 54 African countries provided nearly 70% of Africa's gross domestic product, 81% of listed firms, and over 90% of market capitalization. 121 papers, that's 76% of all papers on Africa in these journals, were on 5 countries: South Africa, Egypt, Ghana, Nigeria, and Kenya. All British former colonies. I don't know if that's important or relevant, but just note it. There was only 8 single country publications on countries that had no stock exchange. Ethiopia 5, Benin 1, Congo 1, and Sierra Leone. So basically, if you didn't have a stock exchange and market data, you're not likely to have any accounting articles published in a so-called leading journals. 35 countries had no accounting publications, and they were mostly amongst the poorest African countries with no stock exchange, low human developed index scores, and poorly developed professional accounting associations. And this goes back to Colin's point really about the language thing. There's a scarcity of accounting research on the 16 Francophone countries. Only 4 had articles: Tunisia, Libya, Benin, and Cameroon. Next slide, please. Topics. I won't go through this in detail, but the African papers that have been published actually cover quite a wide range of topics, which is similar to the results of the first paper I gave details of. Financial accounting dominated, but there was a lot more on than elsewhere on government and NGO accounting, accounting education, interestingly history, corporate social responsibility. And the African papers used more diverse research methods. Again, archival methods dominated nearly half, but there were a lot of case study, field studies, surveys, and so on. So Africa's been characterized by a relatively wide range of topics, employing more diverse research methods. Next slide, please. Yeah, well, then we looked at the top, the authors with, 15 of the top 32 authors. And to be a top author, you had to have at least 3 African papers in these journals. About half used qualitative methods exclusively, 4 predominantly, and 5 combined qualitative and quantitative methods. Only 5 use quantitative methods exclusively and 3 predominantly. Unlike, if let's say, if we compare Africa with Asia, and 24 of the top contributing authors originated from Africa. And this is slightly different from the first paper because this paper takes the origins of the author rather than in which institution they were working. So many of these top contributing authors that originated from Africa could be working outside Africa. We just don't know in this study, slightly different. But 12 of these, though, of the 32 most prolific authors were affiliated with an African university, and the bulk of these came from South Africa, 9, Ghana 2, and Egypt 1. But what's interesting here is 154, 86% of all the African papers that have been published had at least one author with African origins. When we look at the 25 most cited papers with at least 120 Google Scholar citations, they spanned each of the 3 journal ranking tiers, the 3 major research method classifications, and a wide range of topics, which you would expect from the previous analysis I reported. Next slide, please. So, conclusions. And try to be a bit controversial. If you want to be rude to me and say I'm wrong, feel free, I'd welcome that. But here I'm arguing that if we look at accounting research in developing countries, basically it predominantly serves capital, not people, or strategic development goals. Despite developing countries, I would argue, having more pressing accounting needs and certainly form the bulk of the world's population. Secondly, what are often considered, rightly or wrongly, as being the top accounting journals only publish a very small proportion of developing country articles, although there is variations between individual journals. And so the accounting developing country research is heavily weighted to market-based financial accounting, auditing by large corporations and capital market effects in predominantly large developing countries at an intermediate stage of development, and they have stock markets. Many developing countries have had no research published, especially small, poor ones. And I would argue that because this feeds through to policy, it reproduces a Western hegemony and arguably can constitute neocolonialism. We've written about this in other papers. I won't go into it in great detail, but I'll give an example. For example, many of the World Bank and IMF conditions for loans and aid is often premised on reforms based on new public management principles, which are predominantly based on agency theory and reflect a market-based approach to development, such as privatizations, performance evaluation, and so on. So I would argue that one of the dangers is how articles in developing countries, insofar that they are published in leading journals, justify and influence neoliberal policies of important external institutions. And certainly with colleagues, the research I've done, and many other people, some of whom are in the audience today, if you do close empirical research, often qualitative, you often find that these required changes are adopted, but they often prove ineffective or inappropriate. For example, the accounting changes may be introduced by the government in legislation, but not actually used in decision making and formulating policy. And in the worst cases, they can actually be used to discriminate and against political opposition and so on. Next. If we look at the DC developing country research that's been published, there's a major neglect of what we would deem are important topics for many developing countries, particularly government accounting, the accounting and accountability of non-governmental organisations, the role of international financial institutions, social and environmental accounting, management accounting, professions and professionalisation, which is very important because a lot of Western countries' accounting associations have a major influence and many members in developing countries. And obviously there's a neglect of micro enterprises, farm, agricultural enterprises, certainly corruption, history and culture. And these are important topics. Well, important topics everywhere, but particularly so often in some developing countries. Next slide, please. One thing that's interesting here is the jurisdictional differences between continents. It's interesting that Asia, and especially China, is very North America oriented and to a large extent reproduces research very similar to that produced by North American scholars. But other continents, this is much less so. And as we mentioned previously, most developing country research is from authors from British Commonwealth countries, and it tends to be more diverse. As we've mentioned, UK and Australian journals publish the most developing country articles. To repeat myself here, the qualitative inclined journals publish articles with greater diversity of theory, jurisdiction, and topics. I've just got the thing, I can't read it. Oh, thanks. The paradox here is, though, that the highest citations are on the articles in North American journals on, as we mentioned previously, this narrow range of topics, mainly in China. But it partly reflects the high influence, I would argue, of North American journals on what many academics in developing countries perceive as what research they should be doing, how and on what topics. Next slide, and I think it's the last slide. Fine, yeah. So just, this isn't covered in our empirical research, but something which I think is quite shameful is how many universities, particularly in Western universities, actually put accounting in developing countries on their syllabuses. We don't teach it. And I feel especially angry about this when in universities that have a very high proportion of PhD students from developing countries, and they're not taught anything about accounting research in developing countries. They're just taught about the sort of research that predominates in their particular domain. Secondly, and I know this will come up in questions, and if there's any editors here, they'll say, well, we'd like to publish this research, but it's not very good quality and so on. And there's some truth in this, I will freely admit. But I would argue that the so-called Western leading journals have a responsibility to encourage developing country research. And they can be proactive on this. They can have special issues. going back to the issue of language, particularly for Francophone countries or Spanish-speaking countries in Portuguese-speaking countries in Latin America, there are ways of dealing with language issues. For example, we've experimented by allowing people to submit articles in their original, well, it's often a second language, but they're in French or Spanish, and they will be refereed by people whose first language is French or Spanish, and they will go through the normal review paper, and then, if accepted, they have to be translated, but they have to be translated to a sufficiently high standard in English. I mean, there are proactive things that journals can do rather than just sitting back like that. Thirdly, yeah, the quality of much developing country research is a problem. And there is a need for Western accounting associations and universities to help redress this. Some do. I mean, but I'd argue this often isn't enough and more needs doing. For example, mentoring researchers in developing countries, having twinning in institutions, providing more scholarships from students from developing countries, and helping with the training, especially for PhDs, on undertaking PhDs in their home country, because often they can't afford to come to a richer country. And I think this is particularly true of my own country, the United Kingdom. I mean, we charge very high fees for PhD students to study for PhDs in our universities, and basically we reap in the income, but we don't put much back in terms of scholarships and help back to the developing countries. Yeah, turning to universities in developing countries, there is a need for many of these universities, firstly, just to recognise research attainments and have an expectation of research performance, particularly in those universities that have a research culture and a research expectation. Often, what has to be done to get promotion in these institutions can be somewhat bizarre. There is a need for much better performance evaluation systems of research in many of these countries. And lastly, we need to improve and recognise indigenous developing country journals, including those not in English. And for example, it's often a good thing for these indigenous developing country journals to distribute copies of their contents to academics in working in developed countries. So to conclude, I've gone through a lot of data, but I think it's useful just to have some factual data on this issue. And the aim of this is really to open this up as an issue and also hopefully open up debate and perhaps take more action to get more research on developing countries and to encourage it because it's important. We're globally interlinked. And we can only test our theories and findings in Western countries to see if that they hold, whether they're generalizable by looking at results in a much wider range of countries. And I'll close there, and I'd love to have questions. Thank you.
Thank you very much, dear Professor Hopper, for your contribution and your effort. It's an excellent presentation and excellent paper. Thank you very much. Now, if anyone have any questions, you can ask our speaker. Open your mic and ask your question. Zulfikar Shah, you can ask.
Yeah, thank you, Trevor. Interesting stuff, very useful sort of observations and analysis. Just a comment, I think we need to distinguish between publication and carrying out research, because I think what I understand, there's surely a lot of research carried out in developing countries. Whether or not they are then able to publish in top journals is another proposition, because what I'm finding, or my own experience and observation, is that even for researchers working in UK, they find it quite challenging to publish in North American top-ranked journals, unless you sort of pitch the paper and the area of research which can appeal to those sort of journals. It's very difficult to publish in those journals. And I think when you mentioned that there is a bigger citation of the few studies that are published in those journals, I think it's understandable, because there are very few papers that make those top journals. And that's why when you want to get credibility, or you want to get into targeting those journals, you have to acknowledge, like, what has been already published in those journals. And I think that might be one reason for bigger citations of the few articles that manage to be published in those top journals. The second observation I have is that in terms of archival or positive accounting research, we don't have any comparable even in the UK. The closest one is JBFA, Accounting and Business Research, and a few others, which can publish those kind of work. Apart from that, again, if you look at the qualitative end, AOS is, I think, the only one that we have available, which is 4-rank, ABS 4-rank journal. So I think that itself sort of leaves the question of, the way the ref is organized and the way these are then used in the recruitment and promotion criteria is affecting the way people would be carrying out research. And I think that is affecting to a larger extent, because people would be pursuing areas or carrying out research which they think they can publish in these journals. Thank you.
Okay, I think there's 3 questions there. The first was, you said, well, the distinction between publication and carrying out research. I'll just go back. I don't know if it's a problem, but development policies by World Bank, IMF, and many developing countries have stressed that the biggest returns come often from primary and high school education. And that's understandable, because you're talking about basic literacy and educational skills. One of the problems of that emphasis is that in many developing countries, universities have been relatively underfunded and are almost teaching only. There are exceptions. There are flagship universities in many developing countries where research is expected. So in many developing countries, there is little or no funding for research, and no expectation of academics pursuing research, because they're concentrating on teaching. Sometimes because they're poorly paid, they'll have more than one teaching job. That's quite a difficult policy issue, because is this where developing countries should be putting resources? But I think this is where we as academics in better endowed institutions have a role and a need to help academics wishing to pursue serious research to do so in developing countries. Going back to the North American journals, it's difficult to publish. Yeah, I mean, it isn't new to say that many of the so-called leading journals, North American journals, are very specialized in terms of theory and topics. And I have no problems with what really gets me annoyed with some of the journals is I just wish the editors would be more honest. if they only publish a certain type of research, say it. But you go to conferences and so on. Oh, yes, we're open to everything, every method, every topic, and so on. But when you look at the contents closely and the policies of the journals, it just doesn't seem to reflect this. Archival positivist research, and I think you're talking here in the UK and probably Australasia, and you're saying there's not many archival positive well-ranked journals outside North America. I think I would, okay, JBFA we know about, but I'd argue there's many other journals, Accounting and Business Research will publish and so on. I won't get too much into REF because we've got a bit of an international audience, but I just think these research evaluation exercises are a disaster for good academic work. But I think the important thing here is what institutions rate and which journals do they recognize as important for evaluating research performance. And to be honest, I think in the UK and Australasia, and certainly in Scandinavian countries, they've been fairly wide. I think one of the problems is the sort of historical legacy that with the North American journals being the first in the field, there is still a lingering effect of that they are the leading journals. They're very good. I'm not, they're very worthy journals in what they do. But I think in looking at this, institutions and academics have to recognize a much wider range of journals as being important, pursuing a much wider range of topics and theories. Does that answer your question?
Yeah, I think it wasn't. Yes, it did. It wasn't a question. It was just like few observations based on.
Yeah,
because
sure.
a few years back, we did carry out a similar exercise looking at a particular topic, analyst forecast.
Mm-hmm.
And we found similar observations that more than 90% was archival sort of research, very few qualitative case study research published in these, ABS 4 ranked sort of journals, apart from AOS. There was a concentration of the methodology in particular. So there were some variation from Europe. So, Scandinavian in those countries, they did have like variety in terms of the methods and intellectual sort of contribution, but mostly it was archival. Those managed to publish in those top ranked journals.
Yeah, I mean, I've no problems with archival research. It's valuable, but I think it's a tragedy when that is perceived of what important accounting research is. I would take a much broader definition of what accounting is. Lee Parker and Carnegie have been doing got some recent interesting papers on redefining accounting, arguing that a lot of academics and professional associations have an outdated definition of accounting, but that's an argument for another day. Thank you, Zulfikar.
Professor Tevil?
Yeah, I maybe just a quick response to Trevor's as well, I think, and the comment by Zulfikar. I think there is certainly, even from the REF and the UK perspective, is also what we call impact. So in other words, where researchers are having to engage, from the UK, having to engage with different countries in Africa or elsewhere, perhaps to bring some change. So therefore, the emphasis is not, there's obviously publications, but also about trying to sort of bring an impact on and change in particular context, whether it's governance, whether it's accounting, whether it's the whole aspects of disciplines. So that's where I think working with academics is in different countries is also quite helpful. Maybe not directly talking about the issue of publication. I think the number of publications, the number of is certainly there. I think we know the incentives for publication in many developing countries are also not, there isn't necessarily an incentive to go and target those journals. There isn't necessarily a sort of infrastructure to help towards targeting those journals. That's another issue we have.
Yeah, hi, Tevan. Firstly, I plead guilty. I'm all for impact.
Yeah.
I want to improve things for society and people and countries. And I see little point in doing research just for the sake of getting it into academic journals so that we get better paid promotion and so on. Having said that, I think some of the measures used to evaluate research coming out of universities are somewhat bizarre, and it's a very difficult thing to measure, because a lot of the measures which are being used at the moment are very, very short term. I mean, sometimes the time lag of research can be 20, 30 years almost before it has a significant impact. There's probably research being done now that is relatively neglected, which in 30 years will be seen as very important. And a lot of what's seen as important research now will be regarded as irrelevant. I think an interesting thing, though, where I plead guilty is we took citations as impact, and that's not a good measure. But it's, I suppose it's a case of where we could get data. So I would certainly say impact. One thing that's interesting for a lot of accounting academics in developing countries is, given that they've got a lack of research funding, often they may have to do what might be concerned as kind of consulting type research with institutions. And I think that is valuable. And I think pragmatically, it's got to be recognized, because that may be the only type of research which they can fund. So I think in terms of Western journals, we've got to be much more respectful of that type of research that's coming through, and not getting over obsessed on, how can you put it, rigor, detachment, all the sort of so-called protocols of scientific method. Let such research be flourish and be published. And more action type research of academics that have been working with institutions to try and make positive changes, rather than just being the neutral, detached observer. Does that sort of answer your point, Tevan?
Yeah, that's what I. Thank you, Trevor.
Yeah.
A slight mention. Libya is not francophone. It's just a slight mention.
Oh,
you got everything right except that.
That was my co-authors.
Blame the co-authors. Last time I checked, I don't think the French invaded Libya. But
when you've got wonderful French, it's much better than mine.
Professor Stephen?
There's so much I would love to comment on, Trevor.
Feel free.
But I'm here to listen more than to comment. One of the reasons I've supported Mohammed in his seminar right from the beginning is that it exposes my work to an audience that I don't frequently get to speak to in the Arab world, the African world. And even though many of the folks that are on the call that are from those nations, they're based in European universities for the most part. But nonetheless, this is one of the reasons I turn up relatively consistently to your seminars, and I congratulate you greatly for doing those, Mohammed. I think it's a great thing. However, turning to Trevor, Trevor is like most older academics in his ilk in the sociological based paradigm, in that he has not really recognized the changes that have taken place in North American based journals over the last 15 years in particular. Some of the times when he goes on about neoliberalism, quantitative positivist oriented journals, he's very much speaking to the past. Yeah, there are still problematic journals, Journal of Accounting and Economics, Review of Accounting Studies, the Journal of Accounting Research, that are more or less still stuck in the past. But if one looked at the set of American Accounting Association section journals, you will find most of them have dedicated qualitative editors in their rank. They may not be senior editors, but it is hard to find a significant section journal that does not have a dedicated qualitative editor associated with it. The Accounting Review has me and Chris Chapman editors. It's hard to believe a more unlikely pair to be brought on to being editors at the Accounting Review. And furthermore, we're being kept busy. Carr is now turning out articles that would have only appeared in AOS 15 years ago. The bridge that I provided, which made qualitative sociologically based researchers speak to a broader audience, has now moved to the point where they are speaking to just themselves and sometimes to a broader audience as well. But we're now encroaching on the space that was historically AOS. So part of the view is, yeah, if you go back 20 years, and that is your perspective on what research is acceptable in North American-based journals, it's a very biased perspective. And if you look at the last decade, the last 5 years, things are changing quite radically in North American journals with their openness to different research paradigms. Of course, there are a few holdouts. So that's point one, and that's the age of you and David Cooper and people of your ilk, that you just don't recognize that these changes have been made from a methodological perspective. And so I often have to point that out with the greatest of respect. The key issue that I am interested in from your talk, and that is the issue of bringing more of the world into the research domain. And so I think part of what you've spent a lot of time talking about today is a bit of a red herring. And the real issue is how do we bring a part of the world into the research domain that's respective of the type of research they do. And I'll give you a European case study. 15 years ago, it was difficult to find a German authored paper in any academic journal that wasn't published in German. That has changed radically in 15 years. The incentives to some extent have changed at German universities, but there was a targeted attempt by at least the quantitative types, both the psychology types like myself and the more quantitative folk, to do missionary work in Germany, recruiting bright young German scholars and mentoring them, bringing them to our home institution, exposing them to the type of research that we do and the type of method with the rigor that they are used. In some ways, that changed the picture. Now it is hard to read a major journal that does not have German co-authored papers in it. We've learned a lot more about the German two-board system and so on and so forth. This has happened very rapidly. And while it may never have been a formal movement, I know I never sat down and talked with my fellow behavioral researchers and said, we got to target Germany next. But we did. And we borne the fruit. Now, the question that I think is most important is, how do we transfer that model to much of the rest of the world? Recently, in the experimental area, we featured some papers from Brazil at the European Experimental Audit Research Network. But I think that you have to decouple the issue of methodological primacy from the more practical issue of how do we develop the same sorts of partnerships that were done in some of the European countries that were outside the accounting research area as close as 15 years ago. And what do those partnerships look like? And I think that that is the real fundamental question that we have to address. And how do we then also respect the local research needs as well? And I fully agree with you that there is the capital markets orientation by itself is limiting. But many countries in the developing world seek to develop capital markets. And that is one of their government's policy goals, at least as I understand it. And maybe I don't, because I am far from an expert in this area. But I think that the focus of your talk needs to be centered more on the issues of how do we break down the knowledge gaps rather than concentrating on the barriers to publication. Because I know, my last word is, I know that in my decade of involvement at CAR, I never had a paper submitted from an African country to the corresponding author. I get all the different papers. Between Chris and I, we get all the different papers at the accounting review. I don't know about what Chris has seen. I have not yet got a developing country-based paper. And so part of it is the supply as well. If you don't have supply, you can't publish it. But I think that the supply problem is about making those sorts of partnerships. So what do you think of that?
I thought there were loads of interesting questions, and I'll try and get through them pretty quickly. It's good to see you, Stephen. Yeah, as always, and you're as lively and provocative as ever. Am I biased? Of course I am. Yeah, and I think we all are. So I mean, and of course, I like most academics, have a bias towards my own particular interests, but one has to fight against that. One has to fight against that. Just coming back to these series of seminars, I actually think one of the things of COVID has been quite exciting, that we've learned how to have online seminars, potentially training methods and so on, that can engage a much wider audience. And I think there's a lot of lessons to be learned on this. And I know Tegan's here and Collins. I know there's a lot of thought being given to this by the African Accounting Association of how we can utilize these methods and programs. Now, you say there's been huge change in North American journals. I'm going to give a yes and no answer to this. Our data doesn't support this. the trends have been much the same in recent years as to previous years, although I will accept fully, this is where I agree with you, there are big differences between North American journals and journals in particular ranking sets. And I concur that if you look at the section journals of the American Accounting Association, there is often more diversity and openness. So it's a little bit more complicated.
Well, Critical Perspectives in Accounting has published an article that clearly shows that CAR has changed dramatically. Yeah. So I do not know how your data doesn't see that.
Well, the data is the data. Oh, we've got something wrong. I mean, just speaking on a personal note, yeah, I appreciate that CAR has been, when I say North American, CAR is a much more open journal, let's say, than many other leading North American journals. I fully accept that, and I appreciate the policies of that journal over the years. Coming back to something that's I think is absolutely crucial, and going back to North America, but also many institutions worldwide, I think the key really is the PhD programs. They've got to teach a broad range of research methods and topics, at least sufficiently so that people going down one particular avenue appreciate the contents and approaches of the others, rather than just engage in a sort of slanging match that I've probably just been doing over the last hour. And it's something we've personally I've always tried to do. And so much broader PhD programs. And I think with respect, a lot of USA institutions have more problems in this respect than in many other countries. And where I agree with you 100% is basically making change. It goes back to Stephen's point about impact. Yeah, bringing more of the world into the research domain. Yeah, we could learn from the German example, but I think a lot of the European countries, France, Spain, Portugal, and so on, that are now figuring quite prominently, all of course are relatively prosperous countries, but there's exciting things, for example, happening in Brazil, Indonesia, some quite exciting work there. How do we bring the rest of the world into the research community? Well, I think firstly by recognizing, citing, and reading their work. Also, going back to the first point, we can make much more contact through mediums such as this, and we can help in devising training programs. We can help with mentoring. We can help often with helping with translations and things like that. Yeah, I mean, that to me is the most important topic. And this is why I'm producing this type of research. It's to try and get people to recognize this problem and do something positive about it. And I just agree 100% with that. Does that answer the questions? Most of them. Thank you. Good to see you.
Professor Collins?
Thank you very much. To be honest, I think my question wasn't necessarily a question, it was a kind of comment. And I think it's been made irrelevant by Stephen, to be honest, which was, I think you made, and that's exactly what you said, Trevor, which is, I think you made a point about the performance monitoring and evaluation, research performance evaluation, and the incentivization system and the support structure. You had one big point on that, and I think this is the biggest point. This is the main issue, which I think Stephen made a point about the improvement, and I think your findings actually show China is a better example, because China is almost featuring everywhere, which is a bit more, even not the Europeans, Germans, the French, Italians, which are all featuring now very well. But China is perhaps the best example, which is you see everywhere, whether it's any of the top accounting journals, they're there, and they're based in China. And I think this is where, so this is not a question, but I think this is where the main difference lies, in my view, the incentivization and how the research performance is then monitored and impacted and assessed and so on, and the support structures. This is the main question. So China, you have all the Chinese based in China, Chinese universities, and why are they, kind of hitting these top journals and getting their research. Of course, they become more, what do you call, neoliberal, positivist, market-based, and so on. But generally, this is where I think it is. And I'm saying this because if you look at somebody trained in the UK, or I have a number of colleagues, or myself as an example, and if you follow two individuals, one remaining in any of these settings, and then one going back to, say, Africa, say Ghana, for example, you will see a completely different trajectory, the same skill set, the same, well, at least at the beginning, at the start, right? And so I think this is where the main challenge is, and the incentive systems are different. So you talk about bizarreness, the more, the long list you have, ISS got quite a lot of these kind of promotions. I have got two to do, and it's completely different. And so I don't know what your views are on this particular issue and how that can be addressed. And before I stop, I think I agree. I think, in my view, critical view, CPA is the one that has remained very, very, exclusive. I mean, AOS has now become almost more accepting, even more positive papers, isn't it? It's always been open. I think CPA is all the journal in accounting now, if you ask me, because it's remained the same, effectively, not open, despite the fact that it's very critical. So I'm being provocative here a little bit. And I think the American journals, everything is improved, particularly CAR is a good example. I think everything is improving. Anyway, but the inclusion question, which Stephen raised, I think can be addressed through the incentive, the monitoring, the performance, the support structures. And I don't know how we can do this. Thank you.
I think, yeah, the incentive systems are obviously crucial, and it's let's turn to Western countries first. I mean, particularly in the UK, I can cry over some of the things that are happening in terms of the incentive systems, which is basically just measuring the number of publications in a restricted range of journals, and young academics, to survive, just have to publish that. And it's leading to salami slicing of research. It's leading to research that can get published quickly rather than necessarily being an important topic and things like that. So, and I think one of the disasters is going back to Steve's point, in how many universities would reward their academics if they were to indulge in work helping to develop research in developing countries. There is so much emphasis on publish and perish now. So we have I mean, one of the roles of universities is to diffuse knowledge. And are we doing this, or are we just factories for producing papers to meet certain things? Just a quick comment that it's only CPA. I would disagree with you. I think there's a lot of journals that are fairly eclectic, and I agree with Steve here. There are some USA-based journals which are quite eclectic, QRAM, MAR, and so on. So I don't agree actually with the point that it is difficult to get developing country research published. It's only difficult if the incentive system in your institution has a very narrow range of journals that count, and a very narrow range of criteria. Yeah, China is interesting. It's rather paradoxical, isn't it? A communist country produces so much capitalist based research. Actually, there's some great, very interesting Chinese research, particularly historical research and stuff like that. But there's a story to be written about that, but a lot of it came through Hong Kong, didn't it? Who made great efforts to import leading USA scholars and actually paid their staff cash if they got into top, so-called top American journals. But yeah, and then turning to developing countries, I think it's silly to expect every university in every developing country to be a research-based university. There just isn't enough resources. It'd be lovely if there was, but I'm thinking particularly of the flagship universities. I mean, let's say I don't know what it's like in the University of Ghana, so this is something, but what's the performance evaluation system in the University of Ghana, say? A lot of the flagship universities, they do evaluate and expect research, but when you look at the criteria for assessing that, it's very odd. Often doesn't recognize very good journals, whether they're African or outside Africa, and often evaluates journals that are of exceedingly low quality. And then basically it's often manipulated as well. These flagship universities in particularly African universities can do so much more. Does that answer the question? It's not a very good answer, but
no, yes, I agreed. I think the other part is government policy and so on, but then the emphasis again is equally bizarre, and because while I accept that the UK system, for example, or the bizarreness and so on, and I think it's helped it to be competitive and a bit closer, not too far from the Americans, and even Australia, for example. I think they're being competitive, and I think your data showed. And it's because the government, has to measure this, neoliberalism, again, I think you raise your hands up, and measurements. But generally, I think some form of incentive that drives quality or aims at some form of relative quality, I think perhaps what you would like to see is perhaps would be helpful in my mind, in my personal opinion. But you don't see this. And then the flagship do not do it. I think you're right. The Chinese and there's good examples, or at least if you look at the quality, the institutions are doing themselves. So they themselves are saying this is what we want, and even where there's no national system like UK or Australia or New Zealand or something like that. Thank you.
Professor Tariq. Professor Tariq Ismail.
Yeah, hello. Do you hear me?
Yes.
Yeah, okay. Thank you, Professor Hopper, for the presentation. Actually, I am from Egypt. Actually, would you have scholars who are professional, who can use many different methodologies? But actually, we have lack of data. Most of us struggling to find a suitable journal. Most of the time, we contact the journal, and the most answer for that, oh, you have a small sample size. Oh, what I can do? For example, in the stock exchange market, we have only 260 companies. If I take a panel data for 10 years, so I have 2,600 observations. So, and still we are struggling to find a suitable journal because most of the journals searching for large samples. So,
I'll comment on that. And really, it's the beginning of your question, that you've assumed that the most important problem is a lack of data, and really the lack of stock market data. So it may not be reliable, needs a lot of cleaning up, and it's doesn't cover a large number of companies. But I just wouldn't start from that position. Yes, by all means, do Egyptian stock market data, and there's a lot of studies on that, but Egyptian accounting has a lot more issues and problems beyond the stock market. For example, I've been reading recently some quite exciting papers about how the accounting profession has developed in Egypt since NASA, and there is excellent research. So if we leave stock market data to one side, I don't think you face any more difficulties than researchers elsewhere. I don't, I'll be provocative here, I don't think it's any more difficult to get data often in developing countries than in developed countries.
Yeah, I particularly, I'm talking about the young researchers. For me, I have no problem because I have experience of 20 years of research. For me, I can guide teamwork, but I'm talking about young researchers who has a lack of different research methodology. So most of the Western journals don't prefer to accept or to even give a chance to review the article.
I don't agree with it. It goes back to a comment in the previous questions, and to some extent, if you look at the first paper in more detail, it'll give you more information on which journals are more likely to publish, let's say, Egyptian articles than others. But I would argue, as long as what are rated as well-rated journals is broad and eclectic and basically not captured by one set of researchers with particular orientations, I'd say there's a lot of journals that are open and actually welcome such research. I think it's a question of which journals you submit to and which journals your institution ranks as being most important. Because one thing that does come through our data is, I mean, some journals do publish quite a lot of developing country research, and actually want to publish more. Right. Thank you. It's an interesting question.
Another question from Akita.
Hi. Hi.
Good to see you.
Hello. Yeah. Good to see you. Yeah, I just wanted to raise some comments or questions as well. And I think the first one was on when you said that the limited research, there was more capital market research. And I just wonder what the, you said the most research is serving capital markets, not strategic goals, development goals, and people. I just wonder what the role of IFRS is in this, because its objectives are geared more towards investors. And if some of these countries that adopt IFRS don't have capital markets, I don't know what service they're offering in terms of that perspective. Because even when Stephen mentioned that, yes, most of these countries have the aspiration to have the stock exchange, but if we're not able to research why they don't have it in the first place, because there's no stock markets, then we're missing something. So I don't know what, in terms of IFRS, not what role they're playing in just keeping this going. And the second point I wanted to mention was on when you mentioned recommendations, for example, teaching accounting in developing countries, teaching accounting on developing countries in Western universities. Yeah, I just wonder what your thinking was in terms of the expertise for that. And that would also link to editors in journals. Do they have the expertise to review these papers? and what recommendations are in terms of taking those recommendations forward and being practical about it. What are the actions that we can take in terms of bringing in people from developing countries so we can actually improve research in these areas? Thank you.
Right. I think there's two sets of questions there. I think the first is the capital market research. I think that I haven't looked at recent IFRS in detail, but I think certainly it's a very interesting example, certainly in the past, of how a particular set of research orientations and assumptions have framed policy. And originally the IFRS was primarily based on capital markets. It could, for example, have taken a stakeholder approach. And I think we would have quite different sets of standards. So, I mean, all I'm saying is the research that is highly rated and the research that is done feeds through to policies like this. And I agree with you absolutely. Sometimes, you know, rather somewhat strange policies of developing countries accepting standards which are entirely irrelevant or not useful. I mean, a good example is in countries where there's a high where firms have a high concentration of family ownership. Some of the standards need refining. So, I mean, the IFRS could have taken a different perspective on what constitutes their role and where standards need to be set. Now, I will acknowledge, but I'm not an expert on this, that they come. I mean, even the World Bank has criticised them for this, and apparently they are making efforts to redress this. But I'm not sufficiently expert to make a judgment on how effective that is. On the area of expertise to presumably evaluate accounting research on or from developing countries, I don't see that as a big problem, because I think a bigger problem is the diaspora of good academics from developing countries into Western universities. There are many academics in Western countries are quite capable with the expertise to evaluate and encourage and assist research in this area. And I don't see that as a problem. It's only a problem if the editors aren't aware of this and don't choose appropriate referees and so on.
Yeah, thank you.
Yeah.
Professor Tegan?
Yeah, I just wanted to mention, because I think Professor Tariq just mentioned about this issue of matching between methodologies and topics, in a sense. You know, maybe there's an interest in doing more things, but there's no necessarily methodology. I just wanted to share, this is an exclusive, if you want to put it that way. The Pan-African Federation of Accountants will soon be advertising, alongside with AFA, the call for research proposals of interest for professional. Obviously, this is coming from funding from the professional accountants in Africa. So but I thought, given the debate and the classic, you know, IFRS, why are we having IFRS and all of this, I just wanted to mention the topics that they are looking for. So it will soon be advertised, and colleagues can apply, you know, focusing from Africa. But it will come out very publicly. But I just wanted to mention the topics, just to give you an idea. This is the sort of discussions with the professional accountants in Africa, and then this is what they think is of interest. So I'll just read them. First one, informal sector and SMEs. How are we going to help? How is accounting going to help the informal sector and the huge amount of SMEs in Africa, right? I think, you know, probably if I start counting in my fingers, Trevor, not many papers in your list on that sort of second topic. Transforming financial reporting, making it more relevant to Africa. how to make reporting much more relevant to Africa, how to make SDG more relevant, SDG kind of reporting type to Africa. So that's another topic. Not many, just I'll get to it. Training and employability in development of human capital. So I think that's probably a little bit more on the education side. How to make resilient economy. How can accounting make African economies more resilient, or make help enterprises, organizations. And last one is digitalization. So anything to do with digital solutions for public sector accounting and public sector management. So there you go. In a sense, then I'm thinking, when I see this, I'm thinking, okay, what training, what methodologies, what research training do we have in Africa to address those? And that's coming from, I mean, you might say the profession may have an interest in some of these topics, absolutely fine. It's instrumental perhaps to some extent, but I think they are asking important questions. Some of them are important questions. It's about flipping a little bit the community of African scholars, maybe a little bit towards those topics. I don't know if that makes sense, what I'm trying to get to.
Just a quick comment is the divergence between what they think are important topics and the sort of topics that have been pursued in developing country accounting research.
Yeah. Anyway, that was a...
No, good. It's an interesting example.
Sufyan? Sufyan, you have a question?
Yes, thank you for your presentation, Professor. Just look as accounting is a social science to help company to develop or to help society. But the relation between economic and accounting is very important.
Sorry, it's there's a lot of feedback on
the relation
your system. Yeah.
The relation between accounting and economics is very intimate relationship. For this reason, the comparison between developing system and developed or country, you put any reason. The developed country don't have chance to publish in ranking journal because the editor of a journal of the most ranked journal is not from Africa or from Chile, or from the USA or UK. The political economic for Africa, for example, you don't understand an editor from Accounting Review what is in Tunisia, for example, Cray's economics. You don't hear about this situation, about the IFRS in Tunisia, applet or not applet. There are big problem about knowledge between editor of a journal and the paper submitted to this journal.
I've got to apologise. It isn't your speaking, but there's a lot of feedback for some reason, and I had difficulty understanding what you were saying. It wasn't your English; it's the technology. So I'll try and answer what I think the questions were. Is accounting a social science? Of course. And it's a social science in the full meaning. Yes, it encompasses possibly economics, but also many other social sciences. Almost any social science, I would argue. You raise the issue of editors and with respect to developing country arguments. It varies by editor and journals, and as I said previously, even unconsciously we may have our own biases, but it's possible to get this work published. But I think an important thing also is to develop your own regional journals, but to develop them to high academic standards. So I think it's very important for African academics, for example, to support the new African and Accounting and Finance journal. And for that journal to be, which is deliberately aiming at having high quality standards, and getting that journal recognised internationally as an interesting quality journal. And I give another example. I can think of examples in Latin America where that's happening. Some really exciting, interesting work, particularly in Brazil, but also Colombia. Although I've got to agree with you that speaking as a consulting editor of research on accounting and emerging economies, yes, there is a lot of quality problems in research coming from often submitted from developing countries. Sadly, there has to be a very high desk rejection rate because just very badly written, don't even follow the journal guidelines, inappropriate research methods of statistical analysis and so on. But that goes back, I think, to Steve's comment and the comment of others, is the quality problem is fixable with better training and better help and advice. The talent and motivation of many academics in developing countries is fantastic. The will is there. It's just helping the means. Thanks. That's apologies if I didn't fully answer, the question. Yeah, but it was difficult to. There's a lot of feedback. Okay, thank you.
Is there another question?
Just, Mohammed, thank you. I just wanted to just to add to Trevor, your point about the IFRS not originally focusing on the markets. I think obviously you mentioned the new developments with I think Professor Charles Cho, Carol Adams, and others have been quite keen on this. It's the new International Sustainability Standards Board, which the IFRS, the International Accounting Standards Board, have set up. Of course, it's been quite a difficult process, and this idea of double or dual materiality, which will now have a shareholder or market focus and standards that will have a stakeholder focus. I think this potentially can be a kind of a significant shift. Yeah. Now, it depends on how it develops. It's the early days, they are still appointing membership and things like that. So I think we are all keen to see how that develops. And if that develops well, then I think that could be a shift, a major shift.
Yeah, and I would like to think to a small degree that academics critical of the IFRS in the past have helped move that shift. I mean, obviously, professional associations from developing countries and other people, have had an input as well. But I'd like to think that people requesting such and advocating such changes have had some influence.
Yeah, I think for Charles and Carol Adams and others, you can see clearly. Obviously, there has been these letters exchanging hands like this, so you can observe it. You can actually observe it physically. Yeah.
Are there another question? Stephen?
No.
You don't have any questions, you can open your mic and ask your question. Thank you very much, dear Professor Hopper, for your contribution and your effort. It's really an excellent presentation. And thank you everyone joining us today. And thank you very much for taking the time out to present to us today, dear Professor Hopper. It's been really appreciated. Thank you very much.
No, thank you for the opportunity, and thank you for the attendance and interesting issues and questions raised by other participants. It's been a I've learned quite a lot this afternoon. Thank you very much.
And I hope to see you soon in Egypt, dear Prof. You are very, very welcome.
Yeah. And did you know I'm a croquet player?
Yeah.
And the World Championships are just near my house soon. And the Egyptians often win. They're fantastic croquet players.
Oh,
So
I did not know
that. I'll be watching the Egyptian croquet players in a few weeks' time.
You are nice. You are very, very welcome, dear Prof.
Good.
Thank you.